This is the New Revolution, Objective 1, Part 1, regarding the cultural revolutions against the conformity that existed in the 1950s. And if you take a look at this image right here, it's kind of a Norman Rockwell image. You can see the conformity of the 1950s really evident in this picture. Here you have the standard suburban home, lily white, like we talked about when we studied Levittowns way back in the earlier parts of the year. Mom is getting out of the car down here in the corner. Mom is getting out of the car with the groceries. The kids are all happy in the driveway, making the go-kart with Dad. It's really kind of an all-American scene. And it's really what people wanted during this particular time. Something to be aware of here once again. Remember, they had grown up, or the two adults in this picture anyway, had grown up in the Great Depression of the 1930s, followed by World War II in the 1940s. So at this time, they're looking for any kind of stability they can find. So you'll find that 1950s culture is very traditional. It's very conformist, meaning everybody's going to basically look alike. And it's going to be very peaceful as they can possibly make it. There are some problems bubbling under the surface, though, that we'll get into as lessons continue. Take the men of the time period, for example. Now, in World War II, from 1939 to 45, or our involvement from 41 to 45, men had woken up every day with the idea that they could possibly be killed. Every day they were waking up with adrenaline going through their veins, fighting against the ultimate evil in Adolf Hitler, fighting for freedom. It was a kill or be killed society, and you're on high alert, high adventure all the time, whether you're going through the forests of Europe or the jungles of the South Pacific. Well, when those men come back after the war, they're obviously glad to be back and things are a lot more calm, but this is basically the uniform that they got when they traded in their military one. The gray flannel suit. In this picture you see a bunch of guys going to work and they pretty much all look exactly the same. Short hair, no facial hair, gray flannel suits across the board. Now for men of that time, this creates kind of an identity crisis. They'd gone through 4 years of just sheer adventure all the time, and now they're kind of relegated to just getting up every day and putting on the new uniform of the day, the flannel suit, and hopping on the train, going to work, and instead of trying to defeat the Nazis, it's trying to climb the corporate ladder, holding your boss's hat so you can get in his good graces and try to provide a decent living for your family, and going home to your house where the kids are watching TV and you're showing up as the head of the household, but the adventure in your life kind of is gone. And even women start remarking about a crisis of masculinity among men, the idea that they weren't as masculine as they used to be. This is also during a time, and these are things that should be jotted down on the side, but this is also a time when adventure magazines become really important and become really popular. Magazines about hunting and fishing and going on safaris. These are all things that men start to gravitate toward during the decade. And for women, it wasn't much different either. Women during this time, if you look at this picture, these are probably teenage, college-age women, whatever the case may be. But for women during this time, they had very similar styles and looks, just like the men of the decade had with their gray flannel suits. If you'll notice here, all the women have short hair, they're dressed very similar. This across the board was kind of a normal thing for women of that time. They also, in women's fashion, here's something I want you to jot on the side as well. In women's fashion, Christian Dior had led the way with styles and fashions that tried to promote the hourglass figure. The idea that you should have a very narrow waistline so that other parts look bigger, we'll say. Hairstyles were very short. Girdles become very important. It was a real constrictive time in women's fashion. It should also be noted here that women's magazines like Cosmopolitan were saying that only one in every 4 women in America wasn't going to be able to find a husband because the war had left a shortage of men. That wasn't entirely true, but all of these magazines that were telling women how to act had men as their editors. There wasn't a single woman working as an editor of one of these magazines. So, men were, through these magazines, driving women into certain ways of style and thinking and how they should be. As a result, a lot of these factory working women end up getting married at a really early age. After the war, going through the 1950s, it was very common to be going steady. This is something you should jot on the side as well, to be going steady in high school. The idea was that every woman should have a boyfriend. Every man should have a girlfriend. And it was kind of like marriage JV. If you weren't dating someone in a steady fashion, going steady, then you were kind of odd. Also, the marriage age was very young. Usually around 21 was when couples would get married. Now, my mom and dad grew up in 1950 society, and my dad came back from the Korean War and married my mom when he was 24 and she was 19. They got married in 1952, and that was perfectly normal for the time, as women left the factories of World War II and settled into their new roles back in the houses in the suburbs. Simply put, Americans wanted that stability, especially white people. They wanted that stability living in the suburbs, in their protected homes, in their protected neighborhoods, in their very peaceful lives, their kids being protected, playing Little League and things like that. The suburban lifestyle really becomes the American dream. And people start finding more faith in God during this time as well. Things like "In God We Trust" being added to the coins and the currency, and "Under God" being said more with the Pledge of Allegiance in schools. The bottom line is that the 1950s is becoming a very conservative, safe, stable, traditional society. But again, not everybody is so enamored with it. If you take a look at letter B under gender roles and how they're changing in the 1950s, Sloan Wilson writes this book, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, about a guy who comes back from the war and is completely disillusioned with what he finds. It's based on Sloan Wilson's actual experiences as he tried to climb the corporate ladder in the 1950s and then just quit. He didn't like the idea that he was just a new corporate warrior in a new uniform, just trying to get through a meager life. And as far as women, they also found some difficulties with this as well. During World War II, they'd been independent and replacing men in the factories and served a vital purpose in the war, highly respected and earning that respect. But after the war, they're basically told it's time to go back to the kitchen. Turn in your rivets, Rosie, so to speak, as their sole job, and it becomes just staying in the house and being housewives in what became known as the cult of domesticity. Housewives of that time were expected to be supermoms who could look as well as cook. And there had been a Miss America contest ever since the 1920s. But in the 1950s, they came out with the Mrs. America contest, which had, of course, the bikini competition or the bathing suit competition and all sorts of other competitions, but they were slightly different than the Miss America contest, in which they included things you did around the house. Who could peel potatoes the best? Who could change diapers the best? Who could make the beds the best? The bottom line is that 1950s culture was putting women in a very curious position. I mean, they were supposed to be very sexy, they were supposed to be very beautiful, and they were supposed to be very efficient. They were supposed to be very pure. It was almost an impossibly high standard for a 50s housewife to have to live up to. And popular culture was reflecting this as well. TV shows like Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver, and other shows like this, like I Love Lucy, they all promoted this idea of the husband who went to work and came home, and the wife who stayed home and her sole job was to take care of the kids. Again, this whole idea didn't set well with certain people in society, and they were basically drummed out of the mainstream. I mean, regular mainstream American culture thought they were really controversial. If you take a look at letter B to D, Grace Metalius writes a book called Peyton Place, which basically exposes all the things that everybody already knew but wasn't willing to talk about, that there were problems in towns. This particular book was about scandals involving incest in homes and murders and rapes and all sorts of things that were still probably happening in society, but nobody really wanted to talk about. And if you look at B3 here, you'll notice that women are starting to become kind of disillusioned about everything during the decade as well. Now, don't get me wrong, a lot of women loved being housewives and felt that was their sole duty. My mom was one of those, and she loved being a housewife. But for a lot of others, they were getting a little depressed and because they were told that was all they were able to do with their lives. No outside jobs, no outside ambitions. A lot of women during the decade become a little depressed and embittered because they have to give up careers to stay home and take care of the kids. And while that's a great role in life, a lot of women kind of resented being told that was all that they could do. As a result, psychiatrists started prescribing women antidepressants by the millions of pounds throughout the decade. The most popular one was one called Milltown. As a result, by the end of the decade, women would start going back to work. If you take a look at 3B there, about the jobs that were created between 1950 and 1980 and all the different positions that happened as a result, women were in a curious spot once again because they loved being homemakers, but some of them wanted to be workers too, and they were often being made to feel guilty about wanting to get a job. But that wasn't the only way that people were starting to rebel against society. There was a quiet sexual revolution that was going on as well. Take a look at letter C here. Playboy comes out in 1953, and it was a scandalous enough magazine back then that Hugh Hefner didn't even put his name on the first issue. He was worried about getting death threats. Of course, the first cover girl of Playboy had to be, in the 1950s, Marilyn Monroe. And the Medicine Society formed in 1951 to advocate for gay rights and sexual tolerance. That, in and of itself, was a completely outlandish idea in the conservative, traditional culture of the 1950s. And there were also the beginnings of the beat movement during this time. If you don't know what a beat poem is, it's usually a poem that has jazz of some sort associated with it, or a beat from a bass, or bongos, or a snare drum, something like that, usually involving rebelling against conformity. You'll notice these guys have facial hair or fairly long hair for the 1950s. And the movement is going to involve some real major poems and basically screaming against the conformity of the time, like Howl, which was written by Allen Ginsberg in '56, and a book by Jack Kerouac called On the Road. But if you take a look at letter F, the biggest rebellion of the time, at least culturally, may have been in rock and roll, which was a slang term for sex, so parents already hated it. They also didn't like it because it was a mix of rhythm and blues, which was traditionally black music, and country, which was traditionally white music. Speed those riffs up, and you've got a music style that both blacks and whites like, and that's another reason parents hated it, because their kids were mingling with kids of other races because they both liked the music. The whole sexual connotation of it didn't serve too well either. Songs like Great Balls of Fire or I Found My Thrill on Blueberry Hill really didn't, just basically made parents think it was essentially the devil's music. Now, the early rock and roll efforts are led by groups like Bill Haley and the Comets, Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, Little Richard, Fats Domino, he's the one who wrote I Found My Thrill on Blueberry Hill, and probably the one that parents hated most for a couple of reasons, Jerry Lee Lewis, who wrote Goodness Gracious Great Balls of Fire. They didn't like him because of that, but they liked it even worse when they found out that he had married his 13-year-old cousin. Just as a whole, the guy seemed generally immoral. But you can't mention the 1950s rock and roll revolution without talking about Elvis, who was the perfect symbol for rock and roll. He was the king. It was often referred to as the guy who was white but sounded black. Elvis's gyrations with his hips and everything on stage made women go absolutely nuts. Now, in the modern day, no big deal. But back then, extremely controversial. His brand of music is going to influence a lot of artists, including the Beatles.